Good evening and welcome to the Capitol Report on NTD Television. I'm Steve Lance, and coming up, a major push from the White House to cancel student loan debt for millions. This as Vice President Kamala Harris secures a key endorsement, while former President Trump courts African American voters in the city of Chicago. The latest on the 2024 race. And new legislation to combat Iran introduced in the Senate. This as leaders of the two Iranian-backed terrorist organizations are killed over the past 2 days. In the Organization of American States holding a special meeting to discuss the controversy surrounding the Venezuelan elections, as opponents of President Nicolas Maduro warn of widespread election fraud. President Biden pushing forward with the bid to cancel billions more in student loan debt, coming as Vice President Kamala Harris secures an endorsement that carries weight in some battleground states. Joining us now live is NTD's White House correspondent, Iris Tao. Good evening, Iris. Tell us a little bit more about this election year push.
Good evening to you, Steve. So the Biden administration is marching forward with its plan to cancel student debt for tens of millions of Americans. The Department of Education will be emailing about 25 million Americans in the coming days about what their options are for potential cancellation plans. And it's hoping to deliver that relief in the fall, possibly just weeks before the November election. Here's the White House today talking about who's eligible for that. Watch.
Major step to cancel student debt for approximately 30 million Americans when combined with the administration's prior actions, including those whose balances have grown due to runaway interest and those who have been repaying their loans for a very long time.
But Republican lawmakers are criticizing it as an election year push to buy votes and as physically irresponsible. A group of GOP senators introduced a bill today to try to block that. Meanwhile, in other campaign news, President Biden today had lunch with Vice President Kamala Harris. The White House, while saying that they are trying to recalibrate after President Biden announced that he's dropping out of the race, he is still very much the president. And Vice President Kamala Harris today secured a key endorsement from United Auto Workers, a key union that could sway voters in key battleground states. And as Harris is preparing to speak tonight to a black sorority in Houston, Texas, former President Trump is also stepping up his outreach to black voters by speaking at the annual convention for black journalists. Here's a clip of that. Watch.
I love the black population of this country. I've done so much for the black population of this country. Coming from the border are millions and millions of people that happen to be taking black jobs.
The Black Journalist Organization says they're trying to have Vice President Kamala Harris and to have a fireside chat with them. Meanwhile, that's going to come later. And this weekend, we know that both of them are campaigning, and next week, Vice President Kamala Harris will be campaigning with her to-be-announced VP pick in battleground states. Steve.
NTD's Iris Tao from the North Lawn of the White House. Thank you, Iris. And Senator Lindsey Graham introducing new legislation to combat Iran's nuclear capabilities. This as the leaders of Iran-backed terrorist organizations were killed over the past 2 days. NTD's Washington correspondent Jack Bradley has the latest.
Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina is introducing legislation that would allow the U.S. president to use military force against Iran if it's determined that Iran is developing nuclear weapons. This comes right after two leaders of separate terrorist organizations in the Middle East were just killed.
If we do not change course, Iran will, in the coming weeks or months, possess a nuclear weapon.
Israel's military says it killed Hezbollah senior commander Fouad Shakur in an airstrike in Beirut, Lebanon on Tuesday. Israeli and U.S. officials say Shakur was responsible for the attack over the weekend in Israel-occupied Golan Heights. 12 children and teens were killed by a rocket while playing on a soccer field on Saturday. More than 40 people were wounded. Hezbollah has denied any involvement in this most recent attack. On top of that, Hamas chief political leader Ismail Haniyeh was killed in Tehran, according to Iran state media. This comes after Haniyeh participated in the Iranian president's inauguration. The deaths of these two terrorist leaders of organizations backed by Iran may lead to retaliation.
It is time to end the charade that the world is playing when it comes to Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. They're one and the same.
And here's the White House's response on this.
We're obviously concerned about escalation. And again, without confirming the reports over the last 24 in terms of Tehran, certainly the IDF has already spoken to operations that they've conducted elsewhere. All of this adds to the complicated nature of what we're trying to get done. And what we're trying to get done is a ceasefire deal.
As tensions are high in the Middle East, Israel says that it's not looking for war, but is prepared for it. And the possibility that the U.S. will be dragged into the conflict remains. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Jack Bradley, NTD News.
Situation in the Middle East appearing to worsen. How will this impact the ongoing hostage and ceasefire negotiations between Israel and Hamas? And could the conflict spill into a larger war throughout the Middle East? And what would that mean for us here back home? Joining us now is Executive Director of the Alexander Hamilton Society and National Security Expert, Gabriel Scheinman. Gabriel, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Gabriel, the big question after the assassinations of the Hamas and Hezbollah leaders, being taken out is if it will incite a full-fledged war in the Middle East between Iran and Israel. Here's what the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, said about this.
A big key to trying to make sure that that doesn't happen and that we can move to a better place is getting the ceasefire.
So, Gabriel, Iran's supreme leader just moments ago calling for a strike on Israel in retaliation. Is there any end in sight, and where does the conflict go from here?
Well, thanks for having me. I mean, first, we should note that it's not that there is a possibility of a full-fledged war in the Middle East starting today, starting tomorrow, is that starting October 7th, there has been a full-fledged war in the Middle East in the sense that Israel's been attacked on 7 fronts, most notably, obviously, by Hamas in Gaza. But Hezbollah has started its attacks on Israel starting October 8th and has fired several thousand projectiles, missile, drones, anti-tank weapons, and so forth over the course of the last 9 months. Israel's also faced fire from Yemen, which is 1,500 miles away. It's the distance between Boston and Miami. It's faced fire out of Syria, out of Iraq, out of the West Bank, and so on and so forth. So first, I would say is we should look at the fuller context. That's one. Second is, I don't remember calls for when the United States and the Obama administration took out Osama bin Laden, calls that this would be escalatory. I don't really remember a lot of calls when the Obama administration or even the Biden administration conducted precision target counterterrorism raids or missiles in Syria or Iraq or Yemen or elsewhere, that this would be escalatory. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The point is that these are people who had blood on their hands. In the case of the Fuad Shakur, it's the Hezbollah leader. He also had American blood on his hands dating back to the 1983 bombing of the Marine barracks. So I think the context matters. To your precise question, I don't know what the reaction will be from Iran, from Hezbollah, or from Hamas in that way. The Israeli strikes were clearly incredibly calculated to be able to take out very clear arch terrorists with close to zero civilian casualties, not going after infrastructure questions in Lebanon. And so I actually think it's very difficult for Hezbollah to justify to the Lebanese people, or for Iran to justify to its own people, given that it's a Palestinian terrorist on its soil that was killed, not an Iranian, for them to take the Middle East even further into the abyss that they already have started 9 months ago.
Gabriel, to your point, you have Iran terrorist proxies in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Gaza, all kind of fighting, I wouldn't say necessarily simultaneously, but sporadically. What do you think it would look like if they were all to coordinate, including Iran? That's what I think people are kind of anticipating an all-out war to be. Who wins that war, and ultimately how much damage will the victor encounter, whoever that may be, even if they technically win?
I mean, that is the predicament that Israel finds itself in, for sure. That's the predicament and the problem that Israel has basically let these terrorist forces, these proxies of Iran, build up its capabilities just across its borders for many, many, many years. Now, the counterfactual, though, is if had Israel attempted to preempt or stop the building up of those forces to prevent the situation it's in, it would have gotten roundly condemned by much of the world, including Europe and including the United States, for provoking a war at that time. And so it's sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't, now versus then. Putting that aside, the greatest concern I think Israel has in the immediate term is this threat of Hezbollah. Hamas cannot really retaliate for the taking out of its leader, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran. Its rocket force is basically eliminated. I mean, the Israeli forces are obviously in Gaza, and they are closing in on Yahya Sinwar, as well as the remaining battalions of Hamas. The pressure is at its utmost. It is Hezbollah that has a rocket force of perhaps 200,000 rockets and missiles. And so the concern I think that Israel has is that does it have enough munitions? Does it have enough missile defense? And ultimately, does it have enough ground forces to be able to engage with Hezbollah in a full-on serious war, both in the air and on the ground, while simultaneously dealing with Gaza? And so I think the question that Israel has to face, which is why it did not escalate to the greatest degree, let's call it, after the murder of those 12 children on Saturday, because it wanted to be able to try and send Hezbollah and Iran at the same time a message to say, we're not actually don't want full-fledged war at this moment, although, that is to come down the road.
Gabriel Scheinman, really appreciate your perspective on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
And coming up, a new Senate bill looking to take on the mental health issues affecting first responders. We'll have details on that legislation. That and more when we return.